Hi, my name is Soundarya and I'm the creator of Unshackled Club. Welcome to an edition in the Extraordinary Visa Library, where we bring in past recipients of O1, EB1, and EB2 NIW visas to understand their journey and demystify the process to help more talented immigrants like you get these visas. In this edition, we have Anu Ramakrishnan. Anu came to the US when she was 17 to pursue her bachelor's at University of Washington in 2009. Since graduating, she's worked as a product manager at several companies, including Samsung, Genentech, and currently Applied Cognition. Her motivation to file the EB1 came from an impending layoff in 2020 when the pandemic began. After a year of gathering evidence, she finally got her EB1A approved in early 2021. She's also coached hundreds of immigrants since then and is a true manifestation of hard work and resilience. Anu Ramakrishnan, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive in. Anu, I'd love to jump right in and ask you what motivated you to look into the EB1A as an option, and how did you even come across it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of the motivations started very early in my career. When I graduated from college and started my first job, it was only then I realized how tightly entangled career and immigration were, because unfortunately in college they don't really educate you on all of those constraints. So I think my motivations started early, where I wanted to make sure that I could grow in my career and I could explore opportunities without having visa and green card as a barrier to doing that. But I think the sort of tipping point was when I returned from maternity leave in 2020, March. And I was actually at the brink of impending layoff because essentially, due to COVID and due to, various cost-cutting measures, the company was essentially going to tear down their digital health efforts. And so while I was fortunate to not be laid off at that moment, I did have a very short runway to finding another job. And so it was really at that tipping point when I was very determined to change my path once and for all, as far as not having any dependencies on a visa and also really expediting my path to getting a green card.
I'm curious if you remember that moment. Was there someone who encouraged you to look into the EB1A, or was it more of you knew about the option and the job loss was just the nail in the coffin for you to look at it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I will admit I was aware of the EB1A and even the O1 options prior to, the layoff situation happening. But I never really thought that, I mean, never really researched the requirements or really spent time even understanding if this was a path that I could consider for myself. So yes, I think the sort of forcing function was the layoff event and, the frustration of having to find a job on a 60-day clock, as opposed to living life and making career choices on my own terms. But yes, there was definitely awareness before, primarily from a couple of friends who had kind of pursued that path, as well as a couple of colleagues.
And one of the things people get stuck on when they hear about the EB1 is they go and see the requirements and then they feel scared. Just
Yeah,
and they
right.
think that there is no way I will ever get this. Did you feel that as well when you saw the requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what made my case even more unique and challenging is that when I went about trying to find other recipients with similar backgrounds to mine, or, just I was looking for other PMs who had pursued this path and had emerged successful, there unfortunately weren't any other PMs who were out there. So it definitely felt like a very, a path that's, largely untreaded for people who work in more of the business side of things, who don't work in academia or research. And yeah, and I think honestly for me, it was just very overwhelming to read up all the requirements and, go through the process of mapping back what I had done and trying to see what I could already leverage. And, for things like, oh, judge the work of others in your field, it was like, okay, what is even judging and how do I even go about doing that, right? So those were definitely a lot of inhibitions that crept up through the process of even deciding if this path was for me or not.
I guess the natural question I have is, what did you do when that happened? Like, what was the very first step you took towards
Yeah.
getting the visa once you got to know about it?
Yeah. So I think honestly, the sort of journey went a little bit like this, where my immediate focus was obviously to try to find a job. But then the very first step I took in the EB1 exploration was to really jump in and go heavy into research, researching the requirements and researching what a potential path could look like for someone like me who might consider pursuing this path, right? So I would say researching the requirements was the very first step. Yes, it was met with a lot of overwhelm and imposter syndrome. But that said, I think it was really important for me to understand what does this even entail before I could decide if this path was for me or not. And then the second thing was to really understand if there were any experts who could help with this process. The unfortunate thing was, I mean, I didn't have any peer support, so I didn't really, as I mentioned before, there weren't other PMs or other, business leaders who had actually gone through this path themselves that I could even reach out to get guidance. So the next best option was to start looking for lawyers who might be able to provide guidance on essentially commencing this path.
I mean, in that case, I'd love to know when you met with these lawyers, did the lawyers think that you were ready for filing for a case in that moment?
No, no. I mean, I'm glad that you brought it up because I think I didn't actually realize that before you even put together a case for USCIS, you have to put together a case to get a lawyer to retain you as their client. Because lawyers also have a pretty high bar to accepting clients. It's not like, they'll just take on anyone and everyone to go through an EB1A, right? So I was actually very underprepared when I went into those discussions. Even today, I tell a lot of my mentees to not do what I did, which is just go to them with a LinkedIn profile and say, hey, what are my chances for an EB1, right? So yeah, so in terms of like, was it helpful or not? I think yes and no. I think the part that was not helpful was just not getting the exact information I was looking for. I think a lot of that happened much after I actually retained the lawyer and sort of went through that process, the hard way. But I think honestly, having, this was 3 years ago where there's not as much awareness as there is now, right? So it was honestly the only path to getting access to knowledge and also making progress on my EB1A.
Makes sense. And after you were done with these consoles, I'm assuming that these lawyers said you were not ready. So you you had to figure out like what can I do to get ready? Like how can I build my evidence? So I'm curious, jumping into the different criteria that you applied for, what were your strongest criteria at that point back then?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say, I think in terms of, reflecting back on my own case, my strongest couple of criteria, at least at the time of, sort of like embarking upon this path, was evidence of performing a leading and critical role and high salary. Again, a lot of this was just my own validation. It wasn't like I had actually gotten the lawyers to look at this and validate it. That happened much later, but I sort of figured that, hey, I've been a successful PM at, a couple of really well-established healthcare companies. I have, established seniority through my role, and I've got very high impact projects in all these companies that I've worked at. So that should count for something. Again, this was just based on my preliminary understanding of the requirements. So I think I knew I could make something out of that criteria based on what I already had. And I was very open to looking at what gaps still might have existed and what I would have to do to essentially improve upon those gaps. And then high salary, again, I think high salary was a little bit of like going back and forth. But I think initially I sort of assumed that that would also be something that would work out, just given, I lived in the Bay Area, and I think my salary was pretty competitive compared to other PMs, with the similar years of experience. So I think going in, both of those were my strongest criteria. But honestly, through the process, I actually discovered that there was a lot more that I could actually leverage from what I had done before. So for example, I had actually done a lot of authorship, not with the intention of getting an EB1, but just on my own to really expand upon my digital footprint and sort of build upon my product career outside of the four walls of my workplace. And so after reviewing a lot of the articles that I had written, it turned out that a few of them actually worked out as good evidences for the EB1A as well. So going in, I actually had 3 criteria that I knew I would meet, just based on my own analysis as well as the legal reviews through the consultations. And then I think it also made sense for me to maybe do a 4th because I wanted to make sure I had at least one backup just in case one of these didn't work out. So the next phase in the process was to really try to identify what that 4th criteria would be and essentially how I would go about, developing evidence for that. So that was actually where I think the lawyers were pretty helpful in the process, where they advised that I could look into judging the work of others in my field as another potential criteria. And yeah, the lawyers also advised me on like what I could do potentially as far as peer reviewing or being a judge panel on business awards and things like that.
So there were 4 criteria in total: critical capacity, high salary, authorship, and judging. This is
Yep.
what you were aiming for.
Mhm.
I'd love to go into each of these criteria in some more depth. So, we
Yeah.
understand exactly what evidence did you present for this. So let's start
Mhm.
with critical capacity. So
Yep.
critical capacity is where you show that you play a critical role in a distinguished organization.
Mhm.
So yeah, walk us through what did you present for that?
Yeah, so in terms of the critical role criteria, I basically presented 2 projects from 2 different companies I had worked at. My first project was from a remote cardiac rehab product that I had built with Samsung Health. Excuse me. So that was actually a first of its kind product where essentially Samsung, in partnership with Kaiser Permanente, had essentially proven that there's a way to do cardiac rehabilitation virtually with a smartwatch and a digital platform. And the product actually had a lot of high growth from the time it launched through scale. And the product also received a lot of press coverage because it was first of its kind. It had a lot of great clinical outcomes that it had achieved in terms of reduction in rehospitalization rates and things like that. And so I was able to essentially get my VP of product to validate that I was a very key product leader in the in essentially making this product happen and in establishing a lot of the outcomes both on the product side as well as on the clinical side. And I also had a lot of secondary evidence, as I mentioned, the press releases. I had internal memos. I had, presentation decks and PRDs and things like that to also show, to substantiate the evidences in terms of the criticality of my role. But I would say 50% of the evidence that I presented for this project came from a very comprehensive letter of recommendation from my VP of product. I personally believe that the letters actually went a really long way in validating the importance of my role, why the project was critical, what was the impact of the project on the organization, and therefore subsequently in the field. So that was one project. The second project I presented was essentially an amalgamation of a couple of different products I had worked on at iRhythm Technologies. So one of them was launching the very first patient symptom management platform for iRhythm, which essentially enabled them to digitize the symptom capturing and symptom management process, as well as pave the way for doing insurance reporting and member experience management through the platform. And then the second project was one of which I helped launch the very first near real-time AFib detection module for their wearable ECG patch. And this was also a very critical project for the company because iRhythm was at the time one of the very first companies to actually establish real-time AFib detection and monitoring. And through my work, we were actually able to, present a technical report that went into the 510(k) approval for FDA as well. So the theme that essentially went around with my critical role was I have essentially worked on very nascent 0 to 1 stage products, which didn't exist before and were very new for the company and also for the industry as a whole. So I think that also essentially doubled up as an original contribution in a certain sense. Although I didn't explicitly apply for that category, I think a lot of these projects would have technically qualified for that as well. The second thing is they all had very measurable impact in the for the organizations I worked for and also for the field as a whole, right? So again, being first to market, being able to pave way to building new products, and then also having very measurable clinical outcomes and cost outcomes for the digital health industry as a whole. So again, for my second project as well, I was able to get a comprehensive letter of recommendation from the VP of product there to essentially validate the work that I had done. So so these were some of the examples of projects that I have presented. Again, I think in my case, like having those really strong press releases for the projects I had worked on, I think went a long way to validate that this was in the public domain. There's proof that, there's strong commercial usage of this product, and there's very strong outcomes to validate the importance of this work. And of course, the letters of recommendations were also very, very instrumental in validating the criticality of my role. And why was it that, why were these outcomes ones that I drove versus like other PMs in the organization, right? So I think that's like the very critical aspect of this criteria. Happy to elaborate on more of that, but that was essentially the premise of the leading and critical role category. In terms of my next one, which was judging.
So it sounds like a lot of your critical capacity evidence relied on getting extremely comprehensive letters from people who were distinguished in the organization. I'm also curious, how did you show that your organization themselves was distinguished? Because for someone who's working in a startup, that's a big question is, how do I show that my startup with 100 people is distinguished?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Honestly, I was a little strategic about picking projects in companies that actually had, established evidence to being, distinguished in the field. So let me elaborate. With Samsung, I think, it's a big company. It's obviously a global organization. But in the letters of recommendations that I presented, I focused on the advancements that Samsung had made within the digital health sector. And, what was their vision, what was their strategy and their roadmap. Again, like it was not super detailed, but it was, it was detailed enough to get the point across. So some of it manifested in the letters. Some of them also manifested in the supporting evidence. So for example, I presented press releases on other digital health efforts that Samsung had led and, brought to market. Similarly, at iRhythm Technologies. Now, again, iRhythm is a leader in the, wearable ECG space, but to a USCIS officer, it's understandable that it may not be a very, very well-known company. So that I would have to have had substantiating material to prove that. So again, even for iRhythm, the evidence that I proved was largely in the letters to validate, again, why were they a leader in the, cardiac ambulatory space. And, I had a lot of papers from some of the research work that they had done. I think it also helped that iRhythm was a public company. So I also included a bunch of, information on the IPO and like showing the impact of the products that they have worked on. They had essentially served over 2 million patients. So I think having that as an impact for scale is also essential. So to answer your question, like how does one go about showing impact or distinguish organization for a startup? I would say, like leaning on to as much public information as you can present as possible. I think it's going to be challenging if you pick a project from like a stealth startup, because again, it's very hard to objectively prove that your work is critical, and also the contributions the company's making to the field are also critical because you can't really talk about it or you don't have any material to validate that. So I would be strategic on trying to pick projects that are ideally in like later stage startups or well-established companies.
Fantastic. Now let's go into the second one, which is high salary. So as I understand, high salary is a very objective criteria. There's not much art to it. It's very science focused because you just have to show that you're in the top 10 or you're in the 90th percentile of people in your field, your role, and your location as well. In terms of what you're getting paid. So is that correct, first of all?
Yes, I think from a general sense, that's correct. But specific to my case, I think it was more of an art than a science. And the reason being that, again, this was one of those things where going into this process, I was really confident that, I would, this would be a, walk in the park for me as far as, getting this category knocked out. But what was interesting was as the legal team like essentially started to research this criteria and try to find like SOC codes, they were getting pretty tripped up on trying to find an SOC code that actually mapped closest to product management. There were some specific nuances here, right? So I think there's only one code that actually has a direct map with product management, and even that is not a direct match. It's actually just listed as a additional code or like an additional job title. And unfortunate thing is that the duties and responsibilities on that SOC code per like ONET and all these federal sources was very far off from the project work that I had demonstrated in my critical role. So the lawyers and myself both felt pretty uncomfortable using that specific SOC code to represent my critical role capacity and also reflect, be a reflection of my high salary. So this is where I essentially had to take matters in my own hands, and I did a bunch of research on alternative codes that I could use to substitute the marketing manager code, which was the one they had originally picked out for me. And I think sometimes lawyers try to resort to codes that are used on H-1B applications, but the challenge is that H-1B applications go off of a different set of criteria. They usually try to base it off of your STEM degree and try to prove relevance to your degree. But for EB1, it's all about your expertise and like the contributions you've made to the field, right? So long story short, yeah, I had to do a bunch of research to finally find a couple of codes that I could use to essentially validate the essentially the relevance for the high salary. So I think I ended up using a business operations specialist code. And I actually substantiated it by showing that a lot of the work activities and like the job duties and description that was on ONET and BLS had a lot of overlap with the work that I had done in my leading and critical role. So that was one way I validated why I picked those SOC codes. And then the rest of the process, as you said, is fairly straightforward, right? So once you have the right SOC code and you can establish why you picked that and why that maps well to your job title and your experience, the rest of it is fairly standardized, right? You just find the top 10% sort of benchmark per your zip code and location, and then basically you just show your W-2 statements and any income proof to validate that you do make that high salary. I also had another challenge specific to my case, which again might be relevant for some others as well, which was I actually switched jobs that year. So my W-2 actually had to be a combination of multiple different W-2s as opposed to like a single W-2 statement that would essentially exceed that amount, right? So, I mean, ideally, like let's say the top 10% is 200K, you want to have like one W-2 statement that exceeds that 200K. But in my case, like I had to combine a couple of W-2 statements and show that the total amount actually exceeded that benchmark. So again, that was also another like precise nuance that was relevant for my case.
I had no idea that you had to map what you're doing to an SOC code actually until right now. I just thought you had to find a niche, and I'm just, this is news for me. So,
Yeah.
in terms of W-2s, is W-2 the only source of evidence you can present to show that this is my compensation? Can you also present other things like, I don't know, stock certificates, bonuses, and so on?
Yeah, to be honest, the jury's out on that. I think different lawyers tend to have different justifications for like what comprises of that total salary component. In my case, my lawyers tried to focus on just base and bonus because with stocks, again, I think as long as the stocks have already been earned, so like if they've been vested and you have actually liquidated those stocks, I think that, and again, that would then be captured in your W-2 statement. I think then it would be okay because that's showing that, hey, because of the work I'm doing, I've earned compensation in the form of equity, right? But I think it gets a little dicey when it's like stock on paper, but like it's not actually been vested or you actually haven't like liquidated those stocks, right? So that's where it gets a little hairy. In my case, though, specifically, I only used base and bonus. I didn't actually use equity for any of my high salary validation.
Got it, got it. Fantastic. So you were in the 90th percentile, or you crossed the 90th percentile, clearly, for what you
Yeah.
had back
So
then.
right, I think the again, this is why I said it was a little bit of an art where I think picking a business operations specialist had a couple of different advantages. I think one was obviously like showing the relevance piece to my role, but for some reason, business operations specialist SOC code wages are like a lot lower than a
Mm,
marketing manager or like even an engineering manager. So I was able to show that my salary actually exceeded that top 10% by more than 50K. So again, a lot of people have different opinions on that, like how much higher than the 10% do you have to be? Um, I think from my case, the higher you can be, like the
the
higher
bit
you can be above the 10%, the better. So that's exactly why I said it's a bit of an art and not just a science.
makes
So
sense.
yeah, I would say do your research. Like, don't just take any SOC code just because you used it in an H-1B application or an EB2 application and just go with that. I think if there are other codes or adjacent codes that still fit that job description but give you a leverage from a salary standpoint, I think, might be a better option for you to consider.
Absolutely. Um, okay, let's go to the third criteria, which is authorship. So,
Yeah.
authorship is where you should show that you published scholarly articles in your field in a major publication, trade media, and so on. So, I'm curious, you said that this was a field that you didn't think you had evidence in, but then later
Yeah.
on you realized, oh, I actually do. So, what
Yeah.
were the example evidences you had?
Yeah, for sure. So, actually, in my case, let me backtrack a little bit. So, as I mentioned, I had started doing a bunch of authorship, even before I embarked upon this EB1A path. So this was like 3 years before I even started this on this EB1. I actually just created a Medium profile and I started writing a bunch of articles on product management, health tech, UX for health tech, and things like that. Various different topics like related to my field. And organically, what happened was a lot of these publications ended up, or sorry, the articles that I wrote got picked up by publications within the Medium network, like, the Startup and UX Collective and places like that. So, but I think the NetNet was these articles specifically though didn't have like a very high viewership. They were just published within these, high impact journals, right? So I didn't know going into this process that I could actually use my Medium articles because I thought you had to work on articles that also inherently got a lot of views or like citations or like equivalent of citations for research papers. But what my lawyer told me was, and this is where it gets interesting, and I just had to trust, the lawyer's word on this. But basically, what they said was because you're applying to, more kind of business oriented media and like you're basically positioning yourself as a product leader, um, it mattered more where you publish than how many views your specific work got. And so the lawyers actually said it's more important that you actually get published in sources that have a very high impact factor. So basically like over 10 million MAUs. And as long as you do that, that's sufficient. And it doesn't really matter if your article specifically got like, millions of views or not. So that was actually a big, eye opener for me because as I said, like I had all these articles that were published in some of these noteworthy like product spaces, product and UX spaces, but they hadn't become viral or anything of that sort. So it was actually a pleasant surprise that I could actually use those articles for my scholarly writing. Um, and again, I think I'll also caveat that, some of this could have also just been benefiting from being one of the early birds in this process, because I think what's happened is over the years, Medium is not a very competitive place to publish, right? I mean, yes, I would say like if you just use your Medium articles without actually showing that they have been put through a review process and there's been an extra pair of eyes that have actually reviewed the content and have benchmarked that against a set of guidelines and then have, chosen to publish your work over others, it doesn't make sense to just, write on LinkedIn or write on Medium and then show that, right? So that's essentially what I made sure, where, I made sure that there was a review process. So for example, I used, I presented like the submission guidelines for some of these publications and also went through like used a couple of like feedback iterations that I had received from these publishers as proof that, hey, there was actually a review process to getting these articles submitted. So I would say, yeah, if you're using Medium, like try to make sure that you're only using articles that have been through a vetting process. But the other thing I also know is that, again, because a lot of people do write on Medium, the overall equity of Medium has gone down from an EB1 perspective. So I would say like try to push the limits if possible. Like if you can actually network your way into getting, authorship into Forbes or, Business Insider or even like Hacker Noon and some of these bigger places. Again, I know the path is a little bit more windy where, you have to network and probably submit a bunch of proposals until you get an acceptance. But I think if you really want to make that competitive, it might be worth going down that path. The other reason I think why Medium articles worked in my case, in addition to having, the validation by the sub-publications that actually featured my work, was the content in the articles were also very unique because I had, as I mentioned, I had written about very specific nuances around, human factors and usability for mobile health applications. I had written about how to manage risk as a PM for digital health products. And again, I don't think at the time there were very many other articles that were writing about these specific topics, and also that these were super relevant to the work that I had done in my critical role and the expertise that I was, presenting for my case, right? So I think that also helped sort of solidify and strengthen the evidence as a whole.
That's what I've heard as well, in terms of Medium being the only source of what you're publishing, what you're submitting as evidence, may not be ideal for everyone. And as you said, I think
Yeah.
in your case, it was 3 years ago, and you talked about very specific things, and you also showed that some of these journals do have a vetting process. Because I know on Medium, some journals, like Better Human, for example, has a
Yeah.
very long review process, but
Right.
some
Right.
don't. So, is that all you submitted for authorship in terms of Medium articles?
Yeah, that's right. So I submitted 3
Got
Medium
it.
articles for my scholarly writing.
Wonderful. And as one of the things with these applications is you have to contextualize everything you're presenting,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
an officer wouldn't know anything about what is the UX collective on Medium. So, how did you
Right.
contextualize evidence by presenting additional evidence to show that this is extraordinary?
Yeah, that's a good point. I stuck to mostly qualitative evidence to really validate why this is relevant in my field. So I referenced a lot of other product leaders who had also published within Medium, just as a way to show that, hey, other product leaders also write on this source, and it's, reputed enough that there are people of this caliber who are writing here. And then also showed some qualitative statistics and demo like interests around the readers as well, because it is actually true that I think in product management, Medium is considered a pretty like big hub for information on, if you even just go on Google and search for, interview prep tips or, roadmap hacks or whatever, right? Like the top few resources you'll find are ones on Medium, right? So I also benchmark like some of those statistics in terms of an SEO standpoint. So I would say the focus was on benchmarking myself against other authors and also showing that a large percent of the audience on Medium were people who were in product or on the business side of technology.
That's very helpful to hear, especially showing that others who have this caliber also publish in this journal,
Right.
just like
Right.
me. Fantastic. Let's talk about the last criteria, which is judging. So,
Yep.
judging is where you're judging the work of others in your field as an expert. So, I'm curious, for someone in the research world, it's
Yeah.
easier since they can peer review articles, be on conference committees. And for someone in the engineering world, they
Yeah.
can go and judge hackathons and similar competitions. For someone in the non-technical, non-research product role, what did you do?
Yeah, so this is where I actually relied on the advice I received from my lawyers. So what they told me was that being in, the business side of things, a lot of their clients who had done, who had like IT management or business leadership backgrounds had actually judged business and product awards. So they sort of pointed me in the direction of, hey, here are a few awards that a few of our clients have judged. So maybe this could serve as a starting point for you as well. So essentially, I started to research product and business awards that were nationally or internationally significant, right? Because I think that's the big, requirement from a judging perspective, where the event itself has to have national or international significance and shouldn't be, limited to a specific region or a university or even just a company, right? So I took an initial list from the lawyers, but I also did my own research to find awards that were a little bit more relevant to the digital health space. So the few awards that I had judged, I did the UCSF Digital Health Awards. I judged Cody and Stevie Awards. And then I also did Golden Bridge, which was, again, recommended to me by my lawyers. I did 4 in total. In terms of how I landed these opportunities, a lot of it was just, so the UCSF Digital Health Awards was mostly networking. I just knew some people who were organizing it. And so I reached out to them saying, hey, I'm interested in, judging this event. And, because of my background, I was, able to get in. And then for the other 3, I basically just watched for the calendar because these awards just happen once a year. So I try to get in early as soon as they put out the volunteer call for judges. And it wasn't too hard to get in, interestingly, because I actually thought it was going to be very difficult to get into some of these panels. But I think because I had a pretty high seniority in my title and I had worked at like some pretty large enterprises, again, because a lot of this work is voluntary, I think it was a little bit easier for me to get through and be able to do these judging gigs. And then the other big thing, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is that what USCIS is looking for judging is not just, hey, have you been admitted to one of these panels, but like, have you actually done the act of judging and providing feedback to other people, right? So one of the things that I did was had thorough documentation of all the reviews I had provided for these nominations. So we literally took screenshots of all the reviews I provided. And then the other thing is, some of these judging events actually require you to attend like Zoom presentations and provide like live feedback. So I literally just took screenshots of like those presentations and like my participation in those events, again, as like hard proof that I was part of this event and I actually did the act of judging. And then some of these events actually require you to hit a minimum number of nomination reviews to actually give you a completion certificate, which is also essential to fulfill the requirements from an evidence perspective. So I think for each of these, I actually reviewed like 50 nominations to receive a certificate. So I think I might have done a total of like 200 nomination reviews by the end of it.
Yeah, that's a lot. And when you say nomination review, you're saying that you had screenshots or something, printouts of the fact that you gave feedback to 200 nominees who came to these competitions?
I mean, I didn't actually put all the 200 screenshots in my case, but point being, I mean, I had to do the 200 to get, I mean, essentially I had to do 50 per contest to get the completion certificate, right? So I inherently ended up reviewing like 200 nominations as a whole. But actually in my evidence, like for the actual like evidence for the EB1, I presented like maybe 4 or 5 different nomination reviews, which were very relevant to my work. So just to like maybe backtrack a little bit, what ends up happening with some of these judging events is, for example, like Cody Awards, right? They'll have like a ton of categories. They'll have AI, they'll have like manufacturing, they'll have maybe health and wellness. So in my case, I made sure that I was only focusing on sharing feedback for health and wellness nominations, right? Because again, that's the closest that has the closest relevance to my field. So again, the point was to just collect as many as possible. And then the lawyers and I worked together on what would be the best excerpts to show in the final petition.
Mm. It sounds like you did excellent documentation. And what I realized, kind of understanding this process is sometimes people don't realize how very minute things along the way that they can do can have a huge impact later on. As simple as capturing a press article about you or your company as and when they're published, and not several years later, because sometimes people take down articles after they published it.
Absolutely.
Or a LinkedIn post.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I mean I have a lot of excerpts to share there from like a final merits determination perspective, but like I think I was one of those maniacs who like took screenshots even of little like praises I would get from my
Yeah.
leadership or like peers, and all of that like paid off in the final merits determination because I was like, yeah, here are all these great things that people have to say about me and my work, right? And so I don't have to look too hard to find things. They were already there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anu. This was extremely helpful in terms of understanding the four categories and how you submitted evidence. But I realized for the EB1A, it goes more than just hitting the criteria, and a few more categories are, or a few more components are finding
Mhm.
a good niche where you're actually the expert and
Yeah.
getting recommendation letters and advisory opinions. So I'd love to dive into those right now. Starting
Yeah.
with the niche, you were a product manager in the digital health space. Was that niche enough, or was that specific enough, or did you have to go one more layer deeper in there?
Yeah, good point. I actually left it at that. I basically said I was a nationally acclaimed product management leader in the digital health industry. I think again, if I were redoing this now, I would be a little bit more specific because digital health is now a pretty big industry and there's various different like verticals within digital health itself. Um, but the lawyers and I both felt that, at the time digital health was niche enough and like, a lot of the evidences I presented were also validating. And I think the keywords essentially just replicated all over the place. So yeah, so that's essentially where I drafted my expertise or how I drafted my expertise.
Awesome. And in terms of letters, I know
Yeah.
you got letters for your critical capacity, letters for judging. Did you get letters outside of hitting the criterias specifically?
Yeah, definitely. So, for the final merits determination, which is also called a part two analysis or Kazarian analysis, um, I had to show expert letters of recommendations from basically other experts in the field who could, review and validate my work and essentially validate that I was at the top of my field. Now, what I've heard is that the traditional sort of choice for these letters is to go to independent reviewers who don't know you or have not worked with you and basically solicit their feedback and their validation through the letters. In my case, I didn't actually go to like fully independent reviewers. I went to people that I had actually worked with but were super senior and were also in the same field that I was working in. So to give you an example in terms of like how I selected who these authors were, to be honest, it's not that easy to like find a plethora of people to just go to and say, hey, can you write a bunch of letters for me and say how great I am, right? So I think I basically went back to like six or seven, like I call them my personal board of directors, who essentially I know I can count on for like, any favors or any help and things like that. So two of them were my direct managers, and I knew that it would be best to get my leading and critical role letters from them. So that was an obvious choice. So for the remaining four, I basically went to them and said, hey, I would love to get some expert letters of recommendations from you. And, this is kind of the process of how these letters are structured and things like that. The good thing is, I mean, these folks didn't actually supervise my work. They didn't really work with me on like a managerial capacity. So there was no like hard proof that we had worked together. But they were people that I had collaborated on in like, various different projects, right? So for example, one of them was the chief medical officer at Samsung Health. Another person was, a VP of product at Genentech. Another one was a, PMO lead at iRhythm Technologies. So again, these were all from folks or companies that I had previously worked with, but these folks were not managers. They were more like superiors or I guess KOLs that I had collaborated with at different points. And I felt that that was honestly the best way to get these letters because again, this person has to know you enough to be able to sign off on a letter that says, I believe that this person is at the top of their field based on all the work I've observed them doing, right? And to me, it just feels a little weird to go to people who you don't even know and get like a letter of that, that kind of a that high level of like agency. So Yeah, so I think between the lawyers and I, we agreed that that would be a better path to take. And so that's kind of how I got my expert letters of recommendations.
Fantastic. And I think the independent review generally comes from an advisory opinion group, which once again is when USAID wrote the law, back in 1990,
Yeah.
it made more sense for artists to get that
Right, right.
for advisory opinions. Even I don't know how that applies in the product management field, which came up only in the last, I would say, decade or so, in
Yeah.
terms of a prominent role. So how many letters did you get? Did you have, because some lawyers say get as little as possible because you don't want to dilute your application with too many letters, and others say it's okay, like get as many as you can. So what was your direction?
Oh, my general like mantra was less is more. So
Hmm.
I got 2 letters for my critical role, as I said, and then I got 3 letters for the expert letters of recommendations. So 5 in total.
Gotcha. And these 3 letters that you got, were they talking about different aspects of you as a product leader, or were they all kind of converging to the same story?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in each of these letters, I actually had a section that literally said, how do you know this candidate, and in what capacity have you worked together or something like that. And so those sections were different, obviously, for each person. And so I had them evaluate my capabilities through the various projects I had worked with them on. So they were those like differences in those letters. But I think like the conclusion net was, I mean, again, at the end of the day, they were evaluating me not just for the work I did in those companies, but also they were reviewing like some of the speaking events I had done, the articles I had written, and I had taught a few courses, so they had also like mentioned some of the excerpts from like the courses I had done, stuff like that. So point being, the focus was holistic evaluation, and they were definitely aspects that replicated across the letters. But I think the thing that made it unique was the relationship I had built with those individual advisory members, and the different lens through which they had evaluated my work within those companies.
Fantastic. Um, I want to touch upon one last topic
Mhm.
on this kind of area is, I know you talked about finding a few lawyers, getting their consults in the beginning. How did you choose the lawyer you went ahead with? Was it more of a gut feeling that this seems right, or something more objective than that?
Yeah, honestly, I didn't have the luxury of a lot of choices because, as I said, I wasn't super prepared going into these discussions. And I think the challenge also was I didn't know a lot. I mean, I didn't see a lot of lawyers who had demonstrated expertise representing people with a background similar to mine. So I would say that was the only thing I actually optimized for. Like, I know I mean, I spoke to lawyers who had great statistics, like, 90% and higher approval rates and things like that. But literally every single applicant of theirs were PhDs or folks who were working in academia. So I knew that that would not be a good fit. So I worked with a lawyer who essentially had proven testimonials and, a track record of actually representing not PMs, but people who are in either program management or IT leadership or, business development roles. So I think that in and of itself instilled enough confidence that, hey, if they've done it for, people with these backgrounds, it seems feasible that they would be able to put together a good case for me as well. So it was a little bit of, objective evaluation, and, a lot of it was gut feeling at the end of the day.
And that makes sense because once again, I think there aren't as many product leaders getting EB1As as there are PhD students and researchers.
Right.
So it makes sense to go with someone who's had some experience in the past. And fortunately, in your case, it worked out without an RFP, without a denial, right? You got the
Mhm.
approval in
Yeah,
the beginning
yeah.
itself. Amazing. Coming to the last kind of section of this podcast, I want to talk about some of the more emotional challenges that you might have faced along the way. So, starting
Mhm.
with, I'd love to know what were some of the struggles you faced as you were building your case? Because you had a full time job, there was an impending layoff scenario that was happening, which I'm sure had a hit on your mental health, and you have a family to manage. So, I'm curious, do you remember moments when you felt just emotionally drained in the process?
Yeah, I think every month I would go through a what do you call it? Like a mini panic attack. And like I think more than a panic attack, more than like feeling overwhelmed with just the amount of things I had to do, it was that constant imposter syndrome of like, little things like, I would go into like the intrawebs and read like a bunch of stuff on Track It, or, some of these, crowdsourced forums, and be like, oh, well, why am I even applying? Like, I don't even think I stand a chance, right? Looking at some of the stuff that's out there. So I think, yeah, there was just constant like, imposter syndrome kind of kicking in every now and then. And I think it was a lot of the emotional work I had to put in was to overcome that and be like, hey, at least I'm on this path. I've taken the first step of applying, right? And I think right there I'm being different from a lot of my peers, right? So I think in terms of like how I managed it all, I think it came down to just ruthless prioritization. And I sort of approached it just like I would approach building a product, right? So I tried to build like the minimum valuable case that I could with the resources and the artifacts I already had. For example, there were certain criteria like memberships and press coverage that were sort of in my backlog, but I decided, hey, for this first pass, let me just apply with these 4 criteria because less is more. And I have, some solid evidence to show for each of these. But if this doesn't work out, let me have a backlog of things ready to go if I had to redo a criteria or something like that. So it was really being very, meticulous about picking the right things to do. And and of course, at that time, I barely socialized with anyone. I think it also helped that it was COVID and we weren't really having many social events. But basically, yeah, it was just work, EB1A prep, and then parenting, like just, basically these 3 things on my agenda for almost a year. And yeah, and I think over time, like, I think doing this honestly was like a very big confidence boost because now I feel like if there's any kind of new thing I have to embark upon, I'm like, yeah, I've done the EB1A, I've gone through that hurdle. Like, how hard can this be, right? Like, that's my approach to any new life circumstance going forward. And I think that's been one of the biggest like wins in addition to having a green card.
Right. Yeah, sorry. I remember in when I was writing Unshackled, in the last chapter, somewhere I talked about how immigrants are not the most richest. They're
Mhm.
sometimes not even the most smartest people, but they're always the most resilient people
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the system puts you through all of these hoops that to come outside of all of this, you have to have some sort of resilience,
Absolutely.
perseverance, and just learning to pick yourself up, when all of these things continue to happen. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
I'm curious, as you were going through the process, you can answer this question from both a logical standpoint as well as an emotional standpoint. But what do you think was missing? In terms of you mentioned that there were no mentors that could help you through the process who'd gotten the EB1 as a product manager. Um, what else do you think was missing in terms of just this whole experience that you went through?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that was missing was just access to people and resources, right? I mean, I think, yes, the lawyers are helpful. They know the law, so obviously they approach everything from that standpoint. But it was incredibly lonely to go through this process all by myself without really even, having an accountability partner or even just, talking to someone who had actually gone through this path themselves. And like, sometimes you're not looking for like advice on category building or anything. Sometimes you're just looking for that little bit of that validation that, okay, I'm not crazy to actually do this. And, it's okay to feel this way. So yeah, I mean, I think not having access to past recipients or, a database of like, hey, where can I even go to find people? Like, I remember scouring through LinkedIn to find EB1 recipients, but like I couldn't discover even like more than one person literally who I could talk to. So that was one. The second thing was just resources, right? Because I mean, lawyers are helpful until the point of helping you understand the requirements, but the buck essentially stops there, right? The rest of it is all you. Like, you basically go figure out, they'll maybe give you 1 or 2 things to like set a baseline, but then the rest of it is all you basically, researching, and then coming back with like options to see, okay, will this work or will this not work? And sometimes lawyers also don't know, like if you're in a super niche field and like they don't have the context to like what what is considered like high caliber in that field, I mean, they're not going to have crystal clear answers either, right? So I think having a database of resources where you know that other applicants have done this, and this is something that has been, has essentially been tried and tested through the EB1A path, I think would have been incredibly helpful. And I think not having that sense of camaraderie, I think one aspect of being an immigrant that I always felt in the last like 14 years that I've been an immigrant is here in the US is, I mean, this might be a little controversial, but I think inherently immigrants are a little competitive. They generally don't want to share more than they have to. And I think some of it comes from just, not having the answers and like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this EB1 thing. And I don't want to tell people because, they're going to think I'm crazy for even trying, right? And there's probably perceived sense of judgment. But I think there's a big negative that comes out of that, which is you just don't have that sense of camaraderie. You fail to essentially build that relationship with your peers, and you fail to essentially get help when you can really use that help, right? So, I think I was thankful that my husband is also an immigrant, and like he understood a lot of the nuances of the challenges that this path entailed, and like, how important this was for both of our careers and for our family. And so I think at least for me, I had that sort of partner to count on. But I know for a lot of people, like they don't have the luxury of sharing this with anyone and really relying on support, right? So yeah, I think some of it is a mindset shift. Like, how do we help people kind of come out of that mindset of, being a little bit more open and sharing? But I think some of it is also just, sort of taking that step forward yourself, and like, maybe even sharing that, hey, I'm thinking about going down this path. I would love to connect with people who are doing this as well. And, maybe have an accountability partner or something like that. So yeah, so I think honestly, like looking back, I just remember feeling very lonely and like very stuck, just going through all the research rabbit holes by myself. And I think if there was one thing I would change, it would be trying to at least like alleviate some of those pain points.
Hopefully, a library that we're creating right now can help other people not feel this. But I think feeling lonely is inevitable in the process, but
Absolutely.
knowing that you're not the only one might help some people. The last question I have for this podcast is, if given another chance, would you do anything differently in your EB1A process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I don't want to think about doing this again, and I never sit back and reflect on, oh, what would be like if I were to do this again, right? It's just really traumatic. But that said, I think the one thing from just a profile development standpoint that I would do differently is I would have just started as early as possible. Literally, I might have, if I had the right resources, or if I knew what I know now, I would have probably started on building my profile from like my first day of having a full-time job. Initially, there were a lot of things that I did just sort of mindlessly, where I was like, oh, let me, expand on my digital product footprint. I did a bunch of like public speaking events. I, presented at a couple of different like conferences and stuff. And I thought a lot of those things could have paid off in the EB1 process, but again, not knowing the requirements, not having a very like strategic mindset on what's going to help, ended up creating some wasted work. Again, I think a lot of these things helped me in my career too, so there's definitely those wins as well. But I would say, like, if I were to do this again, or if I were to advise someone doing this again, like, it's never too late to start. Like, literally, I would have started on the first day of having my full-time job. And I think honestly, I would have also tried to maybe push the envelope a little bit more on some of the criteria. I think, again, I was blessed that I didn't have an RFE, and I was very prepared to getting RFEs and, working on the next phase of my roadmap. But I think I would have tried to push the envelope a little bit more if I had the resources and maybe even the bandwidth to do it. But I think more than that, the former, I think just starting early, like that's just my biggest kind of takeaway.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anu. You're, I think, the first product manager I know, or who I come across, who got the EB1A. And I know you've been helping a ton of other people from non-tech roles since you got the EB1 in the last year or year and a half. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, and really thrilled that you're one of the first people on this podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed reflecting back on my EB1 experience, and I hope this was helpful to anyone who's listening.
Absolutely. Hi again. Thank you so much for watching that. If you're not part of the Unshackled community yet, check unshackled.club to join hundreds of extraordinary immigrants and get access to free consults with lawyers, weekly events and masterclasses, a resource hub, discussion forums, and most of all, a roadmap to reach your goal. Thank you.